night visions, just to give, so that everybody's up on the same page here, we may have a few folks in here that haven't been here before. Israel was in captivity for 70 years, 70 years. They returned to the land that was absolutely destroyed. They had nothing left there. The temple, the very source and center of their culture had been destroyed. And so a contingent came back from captivity, about 42,000 of them, which was about maybe 15% of the people that were in Babylon and some over in Persia. And so about 42,000 came back to what was the land of Israel. It had been occupied by people from all different cultures over the 70 years. So here comes back the Jews that come back and wanting to rebuild their temple, and they were not welcome there. They were terrorized, but they had the authority of the king to go rebuild their temple. But they were still fought with all throughout that time that they tried to rebuild the temple. They laid a foundation for it. They started rebuilding. And they did that for about 12 years, and then they were shut down. When they were shut down for 2 years. During that 2-year period of time, there was an injunction that was given against them. Came from all the way from Susa, which was the royal palace, and it came and it said, "Don't lift another stone." And an army came and surrounded them. An army, armed guards came and said, "You are not to build this temple." So they found themselves in a very, very tough situation. That's when Zechariah the prophet and Haggai the prophet, these two people, were raised up and they were given a message. The message that was given to Zechariah was in one night, 8 consecutive visions. All happened one after another, after another, after another. And these all became a series of encouragements to the people that were there. We've gone through 2 of the night visions. We're on the 3rd. But before we go any further, I wanted to bring up a couple of things to you I thought that were significant. One of the things was, I showed you this chart here, and these were the kings that were in charge at the time, the kings of Persia, Media Persia, Cyrus, and then Cambyses, and then you'll see I put a circle there, great turmoil. I went back and did a little more study here. Cambyses was one of the 2 sons of Cyrus. The other son of Cyrus, his name was Smerdis. So you had Cambyses and Smerdis. Cambyses was the son that was going to be trained to take over the kingdom. The other son, Smerdis, was sent to govern a distant province, all right? When Cyrus died, Cambyses takes over, but to protect his throne, it is said that he sent a contingent of people to his loving brother and killed him to make sure he protected the throne. Cambyses, though, in the 12th year of the reconstruction of the temple, he dies in battle, I think, against Egypt. And when that happens, he has no offspring. So an imposter shows up and says, "Oh, I'm the long-lost brother that's called Smerdis." And so you'll see this thing, a false Smerdis there. And so Smerdis comes, this false Smerdis guy comes in, and it's during that period of time there's great turmoil in the kingdom because they're trying to figure out, is this guy really the right one? And in conjunction with that, there was a conspiracy of this guy who he wasn't of royal heritage. He was part of the security program. He was like the head of the Secret Service of Cambyses. And he and 5 other conspirators gets together and says, "We're going to kill this guy." And so while all this conspiracy is going on, that's when the enemies of the people in Jerusalem, that's when they said, "Now's a good time, let's get an injunction against him." So they approached this false Smerdis. He's the guy that stops the building, and then right after that 6 months, he's assassinated, and then the 5 conspirators they start vying with each other as to who's going to take over and who's going to be the next king. Darius is the guy that does that, all right? And he becomes the next king. So that's something of an idea of what happens. I think one of the questions came up last week was when God said to Zechariah and to Haggai, get back to work, and they did get back to work, how were they able to continue? And if you go back and look at Ezra, Ezra says just that the good eye of God was upon them. So we don't know exactly how God stopped the rulers that were in Jerusalem from, in essence, attacking and destroying the Jews, except that God's hand was upon them and stayed them until they were able to write to Darius and say, Darius, these Jews are rebuilding a temple. They have the right to do it. Darius then writes back, I think it's about 5 years after that, and says, yes, they have the go-ahead. But for a couple of years, they were not authorized to rebuild the temple except God had told them, you guys go ahead. Now, with that in mind, we were talking about one of the names of God. God has many names, and the many names of God describe something different about him. One of the key names, probably the key name that's used in this book, as we go through and we read, and we'll see it over and over and over again, is this name, the Lord of Hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth. And so what does that mean? You know, so I went back and did a little bit more work on that, this Lord of Hosts, because it keeps coming up over and over and over again. Well, if we go back and we look at different times that term was used in Israel's early history, way before the people came back to rebuild the temple, one of those was when Joshua was about to attack Jericho. Remember, Joshua was the one that led the people back into the promised land. Moses wasn't authorized to do that. Moses dies, and so his servant Joshua leads them across the Jordan, and the first thing they're going to face is this incredibly walled fortress called Jericho. That's the big one. So it seems like on the evening before the attack, and I'm sure as a commander, Joshua, the head of the people, I'm sure there's some anxiety there, right? We're going to take on this whole new venture, and we're going to be attacking a walled city, and I can only imagine some of the anxiety. Well, during that walk, he notices this armed general warrior and goes up to him and he says, are you for us or against us? Who are you? And then this warrior king general turns to him and he says, I'm the commander of the army of the Lord of Hosts. And at that point, he realizes who he's talking to. He's not just talking to some general, he's talking to the angel of the Lord who is the commander. And then this general commander of the Lord of the army of hosts tells him this one thing: remove your sandals, you're on holy ground. Where have we heard that before? His mentor Moses was told that by whom? The angel of the Lord, the burning bush that came out. That's what so he knew then that that the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the host of heaven was behind him. So what does that term Lord of hosts mean? Here's a definition. It's the English translation of the Hebrew phrase Yahweh Sabaoth, meaning Lord of armies. Remember, they were surrounded by the armies, the people that were rebuilding the temple, and they were told, shut it down. They were armed force they were up against. So, meaning Lord of armies or Lord of all forces. This title emphasized God's supreme command over all heavenly and earthly armies, including angelic beings and celestial bodies, signifying his absolute power, sovereignty, and control over everything in the universe. So Lord of hosts, when that's used, and you'll see it be used over and over again, it's used 53 times in this little book called Zechariah. It's used only 250 plus times in all of the Old Testament. So it's used almost 20% of the time in this book, Zechariah. And the reason he's emphasizing is God's sovereignty, God's control, God's protection, God's power against all these forces that are against the people. That kind of gives us an idea. Another example, I don't know if you remember Elisha, when he was surrounded, and one of the foreign kings wanted to kill him, so he sent a whole army to surround the city. And when his servant goes out, he says, Master, we're toast. We're dead meat. We're surrounded. And Elisha says, he praises God, he says, show my servant who's really surrounded. And that's when the host of heaven surrounds them, and the servant realizes that we're in pretty good shape, right? Who the Lord of armies is. So that gives you something of an idea. I pulled this is a Red Chinese army. 3 million today, 3 million active duty troops, good looking troops. And from what I understand, that they could actually arm 100 million plus young fighting men from their reserves if they ever needed them. But all it would take is that guy, the commander of the Lord of hosts, just one, and the whole army is of no value. All right, so that gives you an idea. 53 times in Zechariah, 284 occurrences in all of the Old Testament. Everybody so you get a picture of why Lord of hosts is so important? That's a really important one. All right, we were on vision number 3, night vision. Let's kind of recover real quick. Night vision number 1, remember the guy that's the man riding the horse, and there's a series of horses there, and we find out the man really isn't a man, he's an angel, and the angel just isn't an angel. This is the angel of the Lord, which is the theophany, and that is a physical representation to man of God. It's God visibly seen by man. And the purpose of that vision was to assure them. He said, look, I'm going to be with you guys. I'm with you. I understand what's happened to you. I'm going to hold those nations accountable for what they've done to you, and I am choosing Jerusalem. I am with you. And then we had the second night vision happen right after that. 4 what? What happens? 4 horns. Remember the 4 horns? And these horns were like enormous. It's dominion and power of all these empires that have scattered Israel. And God was giving them a message, we think, that of what this is with those 4 construction gods, where God's saying, what those guys do to destroy what I build is eternal. They're just temporal, and I have control over them. So we have 2 of these visions that are given to Zechariah that he's to pass on to the 2 leaders. Who's the 2 leaders of this contingent of people that came back? The governor, what's his name? Zerubbabel. Yeah, Zerubbabel, and then they have a high priest, and what's his name? Joshua. Not the same Joshua that you saw before. That happened real early. This is a whole new name of Joshua, and he's the high priest. So those are the 2 people that are in charge, and they are to be given all this information after this one night. So we're just in the early part of the evening or the night of these night visions. We were on night vision number 3, and that night vision was a surveyor, a man with a measure, like a tape measure, measuring something. And we find out that God measures for 2 reasons. One is ownership, and the other one is judgment. So we figure out, what's he measuring this for? Is he going to judge this land now? And the answer is no, it's already been judged. That's why it's in a heap of rubble. God used the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, to come down, and they wiped the city out and destroyed it. So now it's ownership. It's coming back to measure it for ownership. And we left off in chapter 2 in the book of Zechariah. And we left off in chapter 2, and we'll pick it up in verse 4 very quickly, and I'll catch us up there. And he says God says that Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls, and because it's going to be so big, there's going to be so many people and men and cattle. He said, but I'm going to be a wall. And that's unheard of, that they would have a city without walls. You didn't have a city without walls. It would be conquered in a second. So this is a future thing that he's talking about. There will come a time when God will occupy, Christ will occupy as king, Jerusalem, and he will be, in essence, a firewall around them. We use the term firewall with computers, keep bad things out, and that's what God is saying he will do there. He tells them in verse 6 quickly, Ho there, flee from the land of the north. And he goes on, he says, I have dispersed you as the four winds of heaven. He's telling that to the people of Israel who were dispersed. They scattered, and they went to Babylon, and they went to Persia. And he says in verse 7, escape you who are living with the daughter of Babylon. The daughter of Babylon there in verse 7, that's Persia. That's the offspring of Babylon. The next domination, the next dominion is Media-Persia. And then we got to a point, and we talked about searching for gold. And this is what I wanted to talk about a little bit this morning first. I ended with this. I said verses 8 and 9. Listen, when we read the Bible, we can read it, and you can look for nuggets that are in there, things that will be so impactful that they will become gold to you, that you can build upon in your knowledge and understanding and love of who God is. And this is gold to me, and I wanted to share this with you. I ask you to, as we read through this, to determine who the he is and who the me is. There's two pronouns up there, he and me. So we're going to read through this, and we're going to find out who the he and me is and why it's gold. Verse 8, for thus says the who? Lord of hosts, all right? After glory, he has sent me. Who's speaking here? Who's the person? Huh? The Lord of hosts is the one. He said, it says here, thus says the Lord, this is the Lord of hosts is speaking. After glory, he has sent me. So we know who the me is. That's the Lord of hosts. You know, when I first read that, I said, wait a minute. The Lord of hosts was sent by somebody? That doesn't make sense to me. It's the Lord of hosts who sends. And yet he says, he has, well, who's the he? Well, we keep on reading, all right? After glory, he has sent me against the nations which plunder you, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye. Man, who's the apple of his eye? Israel is. Guess who else is? We are. You're the apple of his eye also. You're his children as much as they are children. For behold, we still don't know who the me is. For behold, in verse 9, I, this is the Lord of hosts, will wave my hand over them so that they will be plunder for their slaves. Then you will know that the, what? The Lord of hosts has sent me. So the Lord of hosts sends the Lord of hosts. I had to look at that. And I said, wow, that's gold. You know why it's gold? Because we see God giving a clue as to the plurality of the Godhead. You have two persons, two individual persons, each claiming the same title of Lord of hosts. Who are those persons? Who is always the sent ones, the one who's going to shake his hand against the nation? The Lord, Son, and who is he sent by? The Lord Father. So we see two persons of the Godhead here that gives us some insight into the Godhead. I don't know about you, but that always sends kind of a chill up my spine. Now we're going to see, and not in the next vision, but the one after that, we're going to see the Lord of hosts, the Holy Spirit. We'll see the third person of the triune Godhead. And here, this is given within the Old Testament. The word Trinity is not in our Bible, right? But we sure have indicators of the multiplicity of the Godhead. Any questions on that? Okay. Key takeaways. What are these things that we as believers can take away from this third vision? And that's what's important in reading the Old Testament. Not just understanding the history of it, not just understanding what happened to these people, but understanding and finding out, what does that mean to me? Why is that important to me? Well, here's some of the key takeaways. Number one, God measures countries, presidents, dictators, kings, and prime ministers for his judgment. Today, that's going on. He's going to measure Putin, Xi Jinping, Trump. Every one of them are being measured ultimately for his judgment. The second one, like the Jews that were set free, yet still lived in Babylon or Persia, we are no longer slaves of sin. God was saying, get out of the north. Come on, all you who are still up in Babylon. There is an ongoing call to God's people to return to him from the dominion of sin. We can fall into the muck again. We're not free from sin. He's paid for it, but we can step into it, and it gets pretty thick sometimes and hard to pull away. But there's always a call to return, and when you return, he's there to help clean us up. And third, God's measurement of a believer is only for ownership. Remember the two reasons? Ownership and what? Judgment. There's no judgment of the believer. Why? It's been paid for. Judgment has already taken place. Christ has died. That was the judgment. He who knew no sin became sin for us. And that judgment took place. And so the believer that puts himself under that umbrella, that covering of Christ, they've already been judged. They're seen as being dead and born again as new people. And so on your worksheet there, the third night vision, Israel, the land, the nation, and the people are God's possession, as you are. God intends to rebuild Jerusalem, and this is a great encouragement to the people who have ceased to work on the temple for about 2 years. They were shut down for that long. This vision also includes eschatological, that means end times, information. The Lord himself will live in Jerusalem, and many Gentile nations will become his people. And that's a future event. Questions, comments? Quiet people this morning.
Do we know if verses 8 and 9 that you were just talking about, where it referred to Jesus, are those end times prophecies there where he thunders all those against Israel he'll deal with them?
The end times event where he'll deal with Israel?
It says that, so that they will be plundered.
Yes.
Slaves. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay. That at some point, yes, at the end time event, and we'll see on that one day. On that day, Jesus is going to destroy his enemies. And then everything, he's just going to leave behind. Anything that's left behind will become plunder for what were once the slaves, which is the Jews. That's what he's talking about. Good question. Thanks, Linda. All right, so let's go now to this fourth vision. And that starts in chapter 3. Chapter 3. And this is Joshua the high priest. And this is all about a man with filthy clothes made clean. Now, the first time I taught this, I kind of jumped ahead. The second time I read this, preparing for this class, I said, I moved too fast. There's two scenes in here. Scene one is what I'm going to show you. Not the high priest with filthy clothes yet. That's scene two. Scene one is in verse 1 and 2. Let's read that. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan. Indeed, the Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is this not a brand plucked from the fire?" So the first thing we see is Joshua the high priest. This is the scene. He's not in dirty clothes yet, but we do see Satan, and we know that Satan from the book of Revelation, day and night, he accuses the brethren. That's what he does. He's the one that sets the trap. His angels set the trap, and when we step in that trap, either with their assistance or not, he's there to accuse. Even believers he's accusing day and night. So there's an accusation that's taking place against this Joshua, the high priest. And this high priest is representing Israel. So he is accusing Israel, and he's pointing the finger, and it's the Lord who rebukes him. And the Lord even says, "The Lord rebuke you." We don't have the authority to rebuke Satan. I don't see that in any of Scripture where we have the authority to do that. In fact, I even see where Michael the archangel says, "The Lord rebuke you, Satan." But at this point, when he's rebuked, he doesn't show up anymore. We don't see him at any point. The next thing that we do see, though, is this horrific picture. And that's now the high priest in these filthy clothes. And he's standing before the angel of the Lord of hosts. And I want you to think of this in terms of purity and absolute impurity. I don't know what purity smells like, but when we get to heaven, we'll figure that one out. But this is a perfect person, no sin, no stain. And then you have the filthiness of clothes. And the image here is disgusting. It's one of clothes with your own excrement rubbed in it. And knowing and smelling the smell of your own stuff up into your nostrils, knowing you're standing before purity. That's the picture of that. I see something similar to this when you see Peter. Peter, he's been told to cast the net to the side. You remember that? Jesus says, cast the net to the right, and he says, look, we've been fishing all night. You know, we got skunked. You know, we're professional commercial fishermen here. You know, Jesus says, well, go ahead and do it. You know, give it a try. Doesn't they fill the net up? When they do that, that's when Peter realizes the perfection of Christ and his own sin, and he says, you know, depart from me, get away from me, Lord. I just can't handle that. And so you can imagine the position of the high priest in these filthy clothes. Verse 4, and he spoke and said to those who were standing before him, saying, remove the filthy garments. This is the angel of the Lord of hosts speaking. Remove the filthy garments from him. And he said to him, see, I have taken away your iniquity from you and will clothe you with festal robes. And so it is the Lord of hosts that removes from us the filthy robes of our unrighteousness. And that's what it is, isn't it? Isn't that a pretty good picture? What's that a picture of? Of when Isaiah talks about our righteousness and approaching God based upon anything that we did. You know, like, you know, I go to church all the time, or I give so much to the church, or I do sermons, or I do Sunday schools, or whatever it is. Whatever those righteousness is, that's what it smells like to God. That's the filthiness of the clothes. It's only the righteous clothes, the festal robes that God blesses us with, that we can approach Christ on. Then we jump down, and as we're reviewing in verse 8, there's something called the branch. Larry.
I'm reminded of the book of Acts where Peter had a vision where there were all these creeping animals and unclean things, and Peter says, oh, and God says, rise, eat. And Peter said, no, I'll eat that unclean stuff. And God says to Peter, what God has cleansed, you must not call it common. Yeah. And that was Peter's command to reach out to the Gentiles. And it's God who cleanses it, and it's God who declares what's clean and what is not. With Unclean robes, it's God who declares that person right and righteous and no one else. You can't do it on your own. You can't even do it with help. But it's through him that we wear the righteous clothes. The branch, this is in verse 8. Just very briefly, it speaks of this. Let's read that real quick. Now listen, Joshua, the high priest, you and your friends who are sitting in front of you. Indeed, they are men who are a symbol. For behold, I am going to bring in my servant, the branch. Now the branch is, and we'll just talk about this for a second because later on we're going to study this a little further. But the branch was known to Israel as the Messiah, the promised one, the one that was going to come. The tree that's cut, that's Israel, the fallen tree. It's just a stump. And there's a branch that's growing out of it. And we've all seen that, right? You look in your backyard or in a stump that's cut down, and you'll see this one branch coming up. It's coming up from the roots. And so what is the root of Israel that the branch is rising from? It comes from the root of Jesse. And the root of Jesse was the eternal kingdom that was promised to David. God promised that David would have his offspring would have an eternal kingdom, and that branch is the Messiah that would one day come. They don't know him yet as Jesus, but that's who it is, and that's who will be coming. And the next verse there is a real strange one, and that's called the cornerstone. Look in verse 9. For behold, the stone that I have set before Joshua, on one stone are 7 eyes. Now that's kind of weird. Why 7 eyes? Perfection. 7 is perfection, and eyes? All seeing, yeah, it's omniscient. He sees everything. So 7 is a number of perfection and totality. Eyes, it's saying that his eyes see everything. And that is the cornerstone. And it's on one stone. Behold, he says, I will engrave an inscription on it, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. In one day he's going to do that. Verse 10, in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, there's the Lord of hosts again, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under his vine and under his fig tree. So we have this cornerstone, and the cornerstone is the first stone. It's the one that's set on the corner. It has to be true and right. Every other stone that's placed is in reference to that. So if the cornerstone is bad, then it's not going to be a good structure. What did they know about the cornerstone? They knew that God laid the cornerstone. It was precious, and they were to rely on the cornerstone. We find out from Daniel, as he was revealing the meaning of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that there was a stone not made by human hands. It was made and cut by God, and that it would take place in the future. They knew that it was a person, and they knew it was a stone that people would stumble over, cause them difficulty. And they knew that that stone was going to be rejected, and that will become the chief cornerstone. God adds this now in Zechariah to all that information on the stone. For behold, the stone that I have put before you, Joshua, on one stone are 7 eyes. Behold, I am going to engrave an inscription on it, declares the Lord of armies, the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the guilt of that land in one day. In one day, I'm going to remove the guilt of this land. On that day, declares the Lord of armies, every one of you will invite his neighbor to sit under the vine and under his fig tree. Total peace and comfort. When will that one day be? Well, Daniel tells us when it will be. He says 70 weeks. It'll take 70 weeks. Now, the weeks we find, the term week in the Old Testament doesn't mean 7 days. It can mean 7 periods of any time. It could be 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years. And we find out in this context that it's years. So it's 70 times 7 years, or 490 years. It's going to take 490 years for the wrongdoing. 7 things are going to take place on one day. They're going to finish the wrongdoing of the nation. It's going to be complete. There'll be no more sin. There'll be a payment for the guilt of Israel. It will bring them into everlasting righteousness. It'll seal up every vision and prophecy regarding this Messiah, and it will anoint the most holy place of the Messiah. All of those things will take place in one day. When will that one day be? Well, it says when the command to rebuild Israel, when that takes place, then 70 weeks of years, 490 years, all the way till the end. At this point, that's when Christ will return, and that's when, in one day, all of those 7 things will take place. 483 years from the command to rebuild the city that was given to Nehemiah. If you remember, Nehemiah went in and he was upset. He heard that the walls were down and people were really, really struggling. This is a number of years later, 50 plus years after the temple has been rebuilt. He goes in, the king sees him, he says, "What's the matter with you?" And that's when Nehemiah said, "Well, my people are in real trouble." And the king then breaks out the checkbook and says, "What do you need?" Writes him up everything of what he needs. And he said, "By the way, not just rebuild a wall, but rebuild a city."
That was approximately 445 BC. And if you count off that, 483 years from that, that's when the Messiah was cut off. And that's what Daniel said. In 483 years, 69 weeks of years, the Messiah will be killed. And that's when the crucifixion took place. The time clock of that 483 years, at that point, that time clock ends. It stops. It doesn't end, it stops temporarily. And that begins the church. This is the age that we're in right now. And that age will end when the church is taken out. Could be this year, could be next year. The rapture takes place. At that point, that's when we know that the Antichrist will move, will start a 7-year peace agreement with Israel. When that begins, that's when the time clock of Israel begins, and that's called the tribulation. And at the end of that time, on that day when Christ returns, that's when it takes place, and that's when all of these things happen to Israel. On that one day, it'll be completed, and I am out of time. So, any Jeff?
I find it interesting that the age of grace that we're in right now was never really spoken of in the past. It's what Paul refers to as the mystery.
It is, yeah. Paul calls it the mystery of the church, sure. Yeah, we're in an age that was never seen by the prophets. They saw over that, they saw the end, but they didn't see that gap in time. And we're in that gap in time. Good point, yep. Anybody else? Glenda?
When he talks about putting them the clean clothes on him.
Yes.
We went over verse 4 where he took the robe off and gave him a clean robe.
Yes.
The next verse that talks about the turban.
Yes.
The clean turban and garments on him. And
Yeah.
then at the very end it says, while the angel of the Lord was standing by.
Yeah.
To me it's just a picture of Jesus waiting to do his thing. He hadn't given salvation yet, but that was, he was presenting a picture of what
Right.
he was going to do.
Yeah, that's right. And it even talks about that and says that's a future event. If we look at
Verse 7.
verse 8. Now listen, Joshua the high priest, you and your friends are sitting in front of you. Indeed, they are men who are a symbol, for behold, I'm going to bring in my servant the brand. It's a future event. You're symbolic of what will eventually take place. Yeah, good. Okay, anybody else? Good deal. Let's call it a day. Bless all of you, and we'll see you next week.